Unbound is a collection of Indian women's writings spanning the last 2000 years. It does not represent all Indian women's writing across time. It is a small selection of what I think as editor, what I felt were the most significant, some of the most powerful, and also some of the most representative in a sense from a linguistic and a geographical spread. I wanted to make sure that as many languages as possible were represented in the book, and as many historical eras were represented as well. So for instance, we have translations from works written in Pali from the ancient era. There is a lot of medieval literature available to us. Not all of it is available in translation, so that was one thing that I was restricted by. I could only work with texts that are already available in English translation. But there are writers spanning all the way from Kashmir down to, of course, Tamil Nadu and Bengali, Assamese, the northeast states. There are Naga writers, there are Gujarati writers, all kinds of writers, and all kinds of themes as well. I think one of the things that I wanted to do with this book was that there is this kind of stereotype about what women's writing is. I mean, what is women's writing? What do women write about? What kind of genres do they tackle? What kind of what are the things that women are interested in, and what do they comment on? What are their thoughts on different things? And there's a kind of feeling, I think, in general, that women tend to write about domestic things, and that's also a stereotype that I kind of had somewhere at the back of my mind. And when I started researching this book, I discovered that actually that's completely false and misleading, and also I think a somewhat dismissive kind of approach to women's writing. There are women who've written about very political themes, and in an outright political way, and also about domestic themes in a more nuanced political way. And I slowly began to see the whole span of Indian women's literature in the course of researching this book, and that's what I've tried to represent also for readers, so that they can read and enjoy the full span of women's ideas about themselves, about the society they live in, and about their own sense of history as Indian women. How do we know what Indian women's lives were like? How do we know what women were thinking 2000 years ago? The only way you know it is by reading the things that they themselves have written. And I think that also kind of, it puts the whole span of women's rights and women's struggles for self-definition and for their place in society, that kind of puts it in perspective. Well, there are certain themes that haven't changed. And I think that is the most interesting thing, really. For instance, one of the themes that appears recurrently in women's writing is the quest for freedom. One of the earliest texts that we have access to, where women's authorship can definitely be established, where women have attached their own names to the writing, is Buddhist writings. The Buddhist nuns wrote verses which were compiled into an anthology called the Therigatha. And again they describe how they came to where they are, how they came to be nuns. The quest for nirvana for women was often tied for the quest for a kind of personal freedom, a very individual self-definition. And while many of these things are that are just human, you know, they're common to men, women, everybody, that disillusionment, search for meaning, tackling grief, all these things are things that they have in common with men. But there are also things that are very specifically, the things that very specifically bind women in a way, you know. Household drudgery, not being allowed to step out of the household and seek your freedom. very often women actually, especially in the ancient and medieval era, women tended to move towards spiritualism, not towards spiritualism itself perhaps, but the spiritual way of life, you know, to identify themselves as devotees rather than just women, because being just women also meant a certain thing, that you had to be bound by the rules that other women, lay women, were supposed to be bound by. I think the other big change is that in the ancient era and even in the medieval era, poetry was the big form, that was the form for writing. There were very few longer texts, although there is one particular text which is not in the book. I didn't include it because it's an interesting text, but just from a literary perspective, I couldn't find a particular chapter that I felt would be very moving or particularly representative of the women's experience. But the Humayunama has been written by a woman. It was written by the emperor's aunt, actually, Babur's daughter. And it's very interesting that while she does describe, a lot of the book is about, you know, the history itself, that, you know, my father came and he fought this war, and then so and so fought this war, and then this happened and then that happened. A lot of the book actually is about also that we celebrated such and such feast, and there was so much money, and then this much was spent, and then we had all these different kinds of foods, and we had and such and such gift was given to such and such noble lord and lady. And perhaps that is a very, that perspective only comes from being both in the woman's world and in the man's world, in a sense, you know, because she wasn't just a political person, she was also in the zanana. So that was very interesting for me. And there are autobiographies written by queens and princesses at various times, but literacy itself was, you know, up until the modern era, it was a very rare thing, not just for women, also for men, but for women it was particularly controlled, especially the upper class and upper caste women, because these are women for whom resources were not a problem. The men in the family were being educated, but the women were not being educated. And I think that was a big battle that was fought. And once the print revolution happened around the, you know, 18th, 19th century, late 18th and early 19th century, that is when you see many more themes happening, because one, you now had newspapers and magazines and things which earlier just did not exist, at least as far as we know did not exist. So women didn't have to write only poetry or plays or dramas, you know, suddenly they could write for the newspaper, they could write memoirs, they could write essays, they could write arguments and debates to kind of contest, you know, certain topics in policy or politics and things like that. And then of course the novel came. Earlier we never had novels. A novel, if you look at literature, the history of literature, the novel is a relatively recent phenomena, only about 200 years old, and our literary history is, as far as we can establish for Indian women, is more than 2000 years old. So if you look at that in the spectrum, novels are a very small and new entrant, but it also, because we live in the times we do, and because we read and consume so much, and the novel is kind of now the dominant way we consume and learn to appreciate stories. So perhaps because of that, we've seen a kind of bigger flowering of literature. It's all literature, but including women's and Indian women's literature as well, through the novel and the novella and the short story, all the modern forms of writing, so to speak. The book is arranged thematically. I kind of was playing with the idea of ras. Like in the Indian tradition, there is the navras, right? There are all these different moods. So if I look at stereotypes, women's writing would have been typically confined to, say, bhakti or to Sringar, or, you know, but I think that women's writing is much more than that. So initially my idea was to divide it by ras, but then I looked at it and I thought that it was more than just ras. They weren't just looking at mood, they were also looking, some of the writings are just very directly kind of politicized, and I felt that it was fair to look at them as political pieces of writing. And if you look at it, like for instance, battle is a theme. It appears even in medieval literature, but we don't associate women with battle writing, but women have their own battles, and there are battles of different kinds, not just going out to war, you know. I mean, there are women who've been part of, say, guerrilla movements, and they've also written about their experience and things like that. So I eventually decided that I would divide it into thematically broad themes. So for instance, there is spirituality or devotion, that is one theme. There is love, which is kind of secular love, which is a layperson's love. There is marriage, which I treat as a separate thing, because marriage is not just about romance and love, it's also about, it's a political and social institution as well. So I've treated that separately. Children and childhood writings for or about children are a separate theme. Writings about different kinds of battles, wars, travel writing is a separate section. So I've divided it thematically, but within each thematic section, all the different genres are mixed up. So for instance, if I'm looking at travel, I'm not necessarily looking only at travel logs, I'm also looking at poetry which is about travel, or poetry which is about, say, war, or poetry which is about the experience of children, but that also includes writing for children. So I'm mixing up all the different genres. Most of these are extracts. If it's from, say, a novel or even a long short story, because the book had to be contained in a single volume, I couldn't represent entire stories or even entire chapters. So each of the prose extracts is on an average between 1,000 to 2,000 words, and the poems, of course, are full poems. There are drama extracts as well, extracts from plays which are on various themes. Well, a lot of the writing actually is in the formal, what you can say, the courtly languages, because those were the languages more or less that survived. Apart from the writings that are spiritual or devotional, because those also survived. People tend to kind of, you know, because it comes from an oral tradition. So even if people didn't write down, say a woman necessarily was not literate, but if she spoke something, people remembered, people communicated, and at some point somebody wrote it down and preserved it because it was devotional. Similarly, court writings, court records, those survive. So there's very little, what you can say, folk literature. There is a lot of literature, but we don't know who wrote it, because typically there are no authors attached to it. So that writing I have not represented. Even in Sanskrit, there are very few texts available where authorship can very definitely be established. I have heard that in the Vedas there are certain verses that are composed by women, and the women are mentioned, but there is some dispute. Some scholars seem to say that no, the women didn't necessarily write it, and some said yes, but we don't know which women wrote what. So then unfortunately I'm not a scholar, so I don't, I'm not able to say. I have included certain things from ancient Tamil, the Sangamira poetry, which was again, you know, the old Tamil, which was a kind of courtly formal verse as well. Prosaic, I think as the languages grew, one thing that happened perhaps was that there was more regional specificity. If you look at a lot of the Sangamira poetry, for instance, some of it is romantic and some of it is about kings and war and things like that. The romantic poetry is very generic, you can say, like, and that's what's lovely about it also, because you can identify with it now. It could have been written for you in the present time, and it has the same power to move you and delight you. With more and more languages, I think what started to happen was that each region and each writer brought her regional experience also into it. So for instance, with bigger texts, if you look at say a novel, it's hard to write a novel without it being rooted in a certain character, in a particular place, perhaps documenting a particular struggle. So I think all of that became, as languages evolved and as perhaps literacy evolved in various languages and publishing evolved in various languages, perhaps that was a natural change. Although I must say that there is probably a lot of literature out there that hasn't been yet translated. So unless one is able to look at all of that literature, it's hard to be able to say anything about which change happened when. I don't know, because for all I know, it's possible that the change actually happened 1,000 years before. It's just that I don't have access to those particular texts. I have read one of the autobiographies of the Begum of Bhopal. It is interesting, it is very personal, but again, because it is sort of coming from a noble, and it is written as an account of nobility and an account of power, really. So for instance, it's very interesting to me to observe the politics between the mother and the daughter, because her mother was also the Begum, she was the ruler of Bhopal, and was unhappy with this particular daughter for the marriage that she made. So she kind of plays these little power games of giving gifts to the daughter's daughter but not to the daughter, and all of that, and it's interesting from a family perspective, so to speak. But I think because she was writing that account as the ruler, she doesn't really tell you everything. It's really hard. You can say that she's telling you only a little bit but not too much, and then from a literary perspective, then that's not very interesting. So I looked at it, I read it, I thought that this is historically interesting, but it's not moving or compelling in the way that if she had been 100% honest about what her feelings were like and what was actually going on, palace intrigue and all of that, that would have been interesting. I think that the people who were writing poetry, for instance, were often writing in a very kind of honest way, especially romantic poetry, because it is possible to be honest, because it's not necessarily about you. For instance, the ancient Tamil poetry, whether it's written by men or women, sometimes there are men writing in the women's voice, sometimes there are women writing in the men's voices also. But the poems, if you look at the translation, the poem begins with the line, what she said to her friend when her lover did not show up, or what he said to his friend when he was going to meet his lover. Now this is obviously very honest. It's coming from a place of honesty or from intense imagination, but it is possible to perhaps do that if you're not a powerful person with something to lose or something at stake, and if you're not revealing your own family history. I think people tend to be by and large cautious. Also, the idea of the memoir, the tell-all memoir, the idea of writing your own history in a confessional way or in a documentary way is fairly, I think, modern. It's people tended to write either for entertainment, say for court entertainment or public entertainment, or they wrote myths, the great epics, or they wrote reinterpretations of the epics. I haven't had a chance to read the full thing because I don't know if the full thing has been translated, but there was a writer called Molla who wrote the first Telugu Ramayana. So it was a reinterpretation, it was her telling. The epic already exists. There is a woman called Saudamini Devi who wrote the Adbhut Ramayana in Bangla. Again, her version is very different. There, Sita is a form of Shakti. She's not the kind of typical image that we have, because there's so much confluence happening. But the idea of memoir is fairly new. I think one of the first memoirs that we have is by this woman, Rashundari Devi, who wrote in Bangla Amar Jiban. She taught herself to read and write, and in the late 18th and early 19th century, she wrote a memoir. And one of the earliest is Cornelia Sorabji. She was interesting. She used to write in English as well. She was one of India's first women lawyers, and has written both memoir as well as lots of little interesting essays. What was it like to be a lawyer in 19th century India? What was it like to represent Maharanis who risk losing whatever little power or estate they have, or want to adopt a child and things like that? So, but I think the idea of actually documenting that and putting it down and kind of publishing it is not a very ancient idea. You know, I don't even know if men were writing that kind of account in the medieval era or the ancient era. Well, I decided I wouldn't include any writers who have been published in the last 10 years. I didn't want to make it that current, partly also because when I'm saying that this is some of the most significant writing, if somebody is just published, it's very hard to decide the currency of that particular writing, right? And you don't know if it's important or not. It might feel really important and completely compelling because it comes from your generation, so you feel very attached to it, but then 5 years later you may just think, that was all right, but I don't know. So I kind of cut the line off at people who've started to just be published like in the last 10 years. But Nilanjana Roy is one of the youngest and newest writers of the people in the book, but there are others as well. Lots of people who've been writing from the 80s and 90s, lots of them. And the oldest, the Therigatha, I would say. Also women, for instance, like Andal and Akka Mahadevi, there is some dispute about when exactly they wrote, and some people say one thing, some people say another thing, but the Pali texts are some of the oldest, I would say.